My life had been somewhat ruined by an experience I had when I was younger. I think so often back to the time my experience happened. Nobody ever believed my story at the time, so I decided to write it now, for the world to see. It began really when I was 14 or so. My family moved home. My dad had been offered a job with better pay, and a mere week later, we had sold our house and rented an apartment in the town we moved to. It was during the summer we moved, so it was simple starting at my new school. When term began, I nervously walked from our apartment building to the school, which was rather close. I hadn't had the chance to meet any local kids, so I knew nobody and was scared of having to make new friends all alone. I don't recall really speaking with anybody that morning. I was too shy, you see. I just took my timetable in a slightly trembling hand and looked to see what my first class was. Math, in room 104. I checked the little school map handout I had been given. I looked at the map over and over. I couldn't see my classroom number at all. By then, no staff were around me and I began to panic. Where the hell do I go? I noticed on the layout there was a whole section to the right of the school that seemed to have plenty of classroom-sized rooms, but no numbers. The class numbers on the far left of the school were numbers 300 to 310. The center of the building had rooms designated in the 200 to 250 range. I decided my classroom 104 would logically be to the right. I walked down the long corridors. Most of the other students were not new, and so they had already made it to their classes while I contemplated my map. Because of this, the corridors were now deserted. In retrospect, I should have just found the help desk and asked them to give me directions, but I was so shy, I'd rather try and do it alone. Anyway, I followed the building layout at the end of an eerily quiet and long corridor. My passage was blocked by a rather old-looking wooden double doors that didn't seem to open when I pushed. This seemed wrong, like this part of the building was not meant to be entered. I had played with the idea that someone had accidentally shut it, or maybe I just wasn't pushing hard enough. I rammed into the doors with my shoulder, and with the scraping sound of metal on wood, they opened. I realized that I had broken the bolts on the other side of the door, which were brittle with rust. Horrified at having broken a door lock on my first day, I was about to turn and run from the scene and just ask someone to help me find my class. I obviously shouldn't be in this part of the school. The new corridor was old and dusty. The lockers were all hanging open and unused. A faint smell of mold hung in the air. But as I turned, I noticed the numbers painted on the glass windows of the doors hanging along the corridor. The one nearest to me read 100. Perplexed, I checked my timetable again to assure myself that I had read my class number correctly. It was clear. My room was 104. And just along this corridor, apparently. I had to begin to walk slowly into the windows of each class I passed. 100 empty, 101 empty, 102 empty except for a plastic skeleton hanging in the corner by a pile of yellowing student lab coats. Still, it was enough to make me flinch. As I checked 103, empty, I heard a voice of an adult man coming out of the room opposite. Room 104. I peeked through the window. Full. Except it wasn't what I expected to see. Sure, there was a teacher wearing a worn brown suit, blue bow tie, and there were students all focused on this teacher sitting apart from one another on an old-fashioned wooden tables. What made me pause is what they were wearing. Kids didn't dress like that anymore. It looked like a classroom from an old film or a show. The teacher stood beside a blackboard dusty from chalk. Despite this oddity, I knocked on the door. I assumed the school had a poor budget. The teacher didn't notice my knocking, so I quietly opened the door and walked in. None of the students took their gaze away from the teacher, who also paid no attention to me. I awkwardly apologized for my lateness, citing that I had gotten lost. I then made my way over to the only free seat in the room and sat down. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I must have interrupted the class, I thought. The teacher began his lesson a few seconds later rather casually. His name was Mr. Tillori. He began to chalk equations on the board and got the class to solve them. The lesson was rather ordinary, except for the fact no calculators were used. Whenever I raised my hand to answer a question, almost to try to win back favor from the teacher, he ignored it and chose another student to answer the problem. The lesson ended abruptly after what felt like hours. By the end of it, I was bored and miserable. I just wanted to get home and complain about the way I was ignored. When I left the room, I felt pangs of hunger. I glanced at my watch and shocked to see the school day has ended. A whole day of math? Horror. I had decided that I hated school. I walked home, going over the day's events in my mind. It was all very weird, but I supposed I would get used to this new school eventually. When I got home, my mother was talking on the home phone. Her face displayed confusion. She heard me come in and frowned when she saw me. She looked somewhat angry and asked whoever was on the other end of the phone line to hold, and then she accused me of skipping school. Confusion followed. I told her I was in class all day, but apparently the school had phoned to say I wasn't in any lessons, and they hadn't seen me after I collected my timetable. I said I was in Mr. Tillori's class in room 104 all day. I must have missed the register when I was late, I thought. My mom paused and told the school on the phone my story. Her expression froze in a few seconds, and she looked at me rather worriedly. She hung up the phone and told me what the school had said. Mr. Tillori had not worked at the school in 38 years. Apparently room 104 was a part of an abandoned section of the school that hadn't been used since the school's shooting 40 years ago. This school thought I was playing one sick joke. That night I went on the web to find out if what the school said was true. Quickly I had found old newspaper articles about the school massacre that had been archived. The madman had simply walked into the school with a hunting rifle and shot the whole class dead. He had blocked the doorway and shot everyone in the math classroom. An old grainy photo showed the class where the murders happened. I recognized it immediately. It was room 104. An obituary showed tributes to the dead and photos of all that had died. I recognized them all too, Mr. Tillori and all the students I had spent a day with. My heart felt like it had stopped. I felt sick. I felt cold to my bones at that moment. After that day, I changed schools. Now, years later, I've written this. My account of what happened to me, which nobody had ever believed. The reason why now? Yesterday I received a letter in the post. There was no address. It had simply appeared through my letterbox. It was a class reunion invite signed by my old teacher, Mr. Tillori.